And we're pleased to welcome to these shores Matthew Fisher, who is Middle East and South Asia Bureau Chief for Post Media News and the only journalist based with Canadian forces in Kandahar, which is where you live normally, right, most of the time?
I do. I live in a tent. 6 feet by 6 feet is my living space. It's a dark tent. It's air conditioned. It's heated. It's not quite the way people might think of tents, but that is because that's how it is if you wish to be close to the troops.
How long have you been doing that?
Well, I first went there in 2002 and have been back many times since, but I've spent about 75% of my time there for the past couple of years. Before that, I was there usually several times a year for long periods of time.
Okay, Matthew, we wanted you in here today because your pieces suggest a view of Afghanistan that is, shall we say, not the conventional wisdom that I suspect most people read about and watch on television. So, just for starters, give us your understanding of how things are on the ground right now.
The war is being won. Some people think it's already won.
By whom?
By the alliance, by the Afghan forces, by the Americans, by the Canadians. But I wish to make a distinction between that. It's not a triumph. There are no big triumphs in Afghanistan. But there's a distinction between that and whether the peace will be won. And the military peace right now is going very, very well, largely as a result of the U.S. surge, but also because of a great increase in the number of Afghan forces as well. And so countries such as Canada now can manage the fight properly. Basically, Canada's mission for so many years in Kandahar was to put out fires. We had a little more than 1,000 combat troops in an area the size of New Brunswick. And we raced around in light armored vehicles trying to put out these fires. Now Canada's in a much more manageable area. It hasn't received much publicity in Canada at all for reasons that I don't understand, but well, our casualties are way down.
Fill in the blanks here, though. We know we're winning because what?
Casualties. Canadian casualties are down by over 50% in the last 12 months. They are down 90% in the last 6 months of 2010. That's a direct result of the U.S. surge and Canada's battle space being easier to manage. American casualties for the year are up. That was expected because they threw in many, many more troops. But American casualties in the last 3 or 4 months are down, and they're dropping like a stone.
Okay, that's casualties.
For the same reason.
What about battles? Are they winning battles that we weren't winning
This isn't
years
a
ago?
war that really has battles.
How about body counts?
Well, body counts we've always, in the West, the NATO forces have killed by a ratio of 20 or 30 or 50 to 1. It doesn't really matter. Overwhelmingly, the Western forces have killed staggering numbers of the enemy. But that isn't the proper metric.
What's
the proper metric there is land held, land where people can go and farm and where governance can arrive. And Canada now controls about 99% of Panjwai district. In the spring, I would guess that Canada controlled 50 or 60%. The real test will be in the spring, whether the Taliban come back or not. Everybody knows that because historically there's an ebb in fighting in the winter as they all go off on their vacations in Pakistan and get resupplied there. But I do not believe it's going to happen in this year. Okay. We will see, but I don't think so. There are too many forces out there.
The view you have just articulated is not a view we frequently hear. And I wonder what you think the reason is that most of the reporting about the war seems to be more on the negative side of things than otherwise.
Well, I think you will find in the last couple of months the New York Times and the Times of London and the Sunday Times have said exactly that. In fact, they've gone further than I have, saying that the Taliban has been routed. The Washington Post had an article about 8 or 10 weeks ago about in Arghandab, where the Canadians used to operate, which is just to the northwest of Kandahar city, that the U.S. forces now have total control. There is always a lag in reporting a war by several months, and also some people are waiting to see the situation in the spring. There is a dispute between the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. military about the actual situation on the ground. The U.S. military feels that there's been much more progress than the intelligence community. In journalism in Canada, I don't think it fits the narrative. The narrative of most journalists here was that the mission was a failure. They started saying this in 2006. They've hammered away at it, and it's very hard for journalists to change their tune.
Okay, but they'd say the evidence of that is that this country and the United States, which had pledged to be there for as long as it took to get the job done, are now saying, we're out of here.
No.
No?
The United States is going to be there for quite some time, indeed. In fact, some American politicians are proposing permanent bases in Afghanistan. I think it is largely misunderstood, this pull-out idea of Obama. It may have been a political mistake, what he said, but virtually no forces are being pulled out. Canada is leaving.
Right.
The Netherlands is leaving, although they are going to stay as Canada is in a training role.
But not with the kind of...
This wasn't because of the performance of our military in Afghanistan. This was for domestic political reasons in Canada. It had nothing to do with the war there.
But aren't those domestic reasons shaped by the reportage which suggests that we're not doing well and therefore we got to get out?
It's absolutely been shaped by the reportage, but the reportage was never right. It was never accurate. And most of it in Canada has been furnished by people with absolutely no background in covering wars. And the biggest failure, I think it's been a disgrace, a lot of the Canadian media coverage of Afghanistan, the biggest failure has been no continuity, and with the exception, the notable exception of Christy Blatchford, no big Canadian journalists stepped up to the plate and covered it there. The United States gets journalists to commit for years to these big assignments. Canada has had, we've had over 300 journalists from Canada embedded in Afghanistan, and 90% of them, 80% of them, whatever, there is an exact statistic out there, and I was the one who put it together, but the overwhelming number never go back. The Globe and Mail didn't have a reporter in Kandahar in the year 2010 for 7 months, not a soul. The Toronto Star, for about 2 years, did not have a reporter in Kandahar. In the last few months, they've had 2 reporters come for a few weeks at a time.
Okay, but that's the domestic scene. You know Patrick Cockburn from The Independent, so I'm going to read
an excellent journalist, a very nice man.
Whom you never agree with, so I'm going to quote him to you right now. Here's what he had to say. There have been important changes on the ground in Afghanistan over the past year, but many of them have been in favor of the Taliban. As U.S. forces concentrate on the south, the Taliban have taken over swaths of territory in northern and eastern Afghanistan, far from their areas of core support. Kabul is a peaceful island, but all the roads in and out are cut or vulnerable to attack. In much of Afghanistan, the government does not exist, or only in the form of local racketeers and gunmen, often wearing police or army uniforms.
This is all true, except that the key line in there is in areas where they don't have core support. The reason why the Taliban was so dangerous, and is so dangerous, in the south, in Kandahar and Helmand, is because a lot of the local population support them. That's where most of the ethnic Pashtuns are. In the north, they're not there. They can launch their suicide attacks and do these things that get them a lot of media attention, but they cannot hold land up there because the population has not historically supported them. Kabul has always been an island, and Afghanistan, whether the Taliban were in charge before the Soviet invasion, 90% of Afghanistan has always been totally lawless. There is no change from that. And it doesn't matter that 90% of it is lawless, frankly, because all of those areas, it's dirt and dust and almost nobody lives there.
Okay, tell me
the
this then.
population centers is where it counts.
Tell me this then. You know, President Obama has admitted that many of the military gains that have been made may be reversible. And I know nothing is permanent in life, but you talked to us a moment ago about the fact that Canada has 99% of a territory that they only had half of as recently as a few months ago. So how do we know whether any of the gains that we have made and paid for in blood and treasure will stick?
Well, this is the problem. I believe that the war is being won, but the peace will be lost for 2 reasons. A big one, of course, is the Karzai government. In an insurgency, when there's some stability and security brought to an area, you must immediately bring in governance. There is no sign of that. Where the Canadians operate in Panjwai district, governance consists of a cell phone, of a Haji Brian, who is an illiterate man, and there are no teachers, no educators, no agriculture experts, nothing.
So that doesn't sound too permanent.
No, it absolutely doesn't. And that's not only where the Canadians are, it's across the board. There's no sign at all, unfortunately, that the Afghan allies of Canada and the West are prepared to step up. The other problem, which persists and it's huge, is Pakistan as a haven for these people. There's been absolutely no solution. In fact, Pakistan has resisted finding a solution to this.
So do you have some ideas about how to A, make the Karzai government a better and more reliable partner, and B, to deal with this Pakistan angle, which no one seems to be able to get a handle on?
Well, the United States has a choice. They could be much, much tougher on Pakistan. I'm not suggesting military action, but in terms of blockades, in terms of terms for the massive amounts of aid that they give. As far as the government goes, there's a real problem, because if it's not Karzai, it would be Abdullah or somebody else. One of the reasons the Taliban came to power was because Abdullah and his cronies were as corrupt as Karzai's guys. The only other alternative is the military and some kind of coup. And there is some talk of that. I have no idea where it stands and who might initiate such a thing. But it is quite hopeless with the current government, and I don't see democratic alternatives, unfortunately. And I very much worry that Canada and other countries have found a military solution, but there's nothing to fill the vacuum that will follow, and it will be slowly lost. It won't be lost in 15 minutes, but over 2 or 3 years, it could, of course, all unravel. And I think right now, I'd say it's likely to unravel, and that will be a tragedy for the Canadians who fought and died, and for how much money Canada spent there.
So it sounds as if you're saying it almost doesn't matter what we do militarily, because we are almost certain to lose the peace, which therefore means none of this mattered.
Well, I believe there still is some hope. There aren't many signs, but if you create stability, then you have a chance to move in. So you can't do the second without having done the first. You have to create those conditions. And then it becomes the responsibility of the Afghan government and other players on the periphery, Iran and all of these other countries on the margins, which of course, some of them want to stir the pot. There's no doubt about it. And that's where my pessimism lies. And I think when they started out with the military solutions, they were hopeful, perhaps stupidly hopeful, that the Afghan government could step up to the plate. This is an absolutely crucial year. If the Afghan government does not step to the plate, if we don't see agricultural officials and schools opening in the tough areas in the south where the Taliban has been strong, if we don't see movement on that by September or October, it's going to be terrible in 2012 and 2013, because things will just fall apart again.
So once our combat mission ends, what do you see the Canadian role thereafter being?
Well, clearly the government has decided, and I don't think it's a bad choice, that we will be trainers. And
of their troops?
Of their troops and police, and there's an awful lot to be done. Canada decided too late in the game, just as we did when we ended up in Kandahar in 2006. One of the reasons we ended up there with a very tough row to hoe was because we dawdled and other countries took the easy spots. Well, for the training mission, all the easy spots have been taken by the Europeans. The Europeans are always looking for an easy spot. So our training mission will be much more complicated logistically than it might have been if the Harper government had made this decision 6 months or 12 months earlier. There's a huge discussion taking place right now about where and how the Canadian forces will go in. I have a suspicion that they'll go in sort of in a battalion level strength and replace an American training battalion somewhere to keep some kind of unity, to keep the costs down, and try to keep the Canadian soldiers in more or less 1 or 2 places, because as it is, the cost will be huge, because NATO's need for trainers is all over the place. They don't need 600 or 800 trainers in one place. They need 20 here, 20 there, 20 there. And this puts the costs up and also creates additional risks for those troops. We will train for several years as a country. We have soldiers who are very qualified to do this. It will be a relatively safe mission. A helicopter can crash at any time. IEDs can be planted anywhere when the Canadians move out of a base to go to the airport. But generally speaking, it will be a very different mission than the combat mission, and the risks for Canadians will be significantly lower, which should please a population which lost hundreds, of course, on D-Day and didn't flinch, went on with the fight, and lost on individual days in the Korean War dozens and dozens of soldiers and didn't flinch. But now, when it loses 153 or 154 soldiers over 8 years, and we're a much wealthier and much bigger country, that's too much for us. And I agree with you, that's where the Canadian population is at, but I believe there's still a substantial minority who do understand that it's necessary to be there and that Canada has acquitted itself very, very well. The Canadian soldiers, we have the best small army in the world. There's no doubt about it. We have outperformed the British. The British have an army that's twice what they can afford, and Canada has an army that's half of what Canada can afford. Canada could have a much bigger army and handle it within our economy if the Canadian people chose. I'm not saying that there's any sign right now that Canadians wish to do that, but that is the capability. We now can run complex operations involving drones, involving all kinds of high-tech things. And of course, that hasn't worked in a low-tech war, and IEDs were the enemy of these things, but it has prepared the Canadian military for the future.
Matthew Fisher, please stay safe over in Afghanistan, and we thank you very much for visiting us here at TVO tonight.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve.